Hello, Gina Piscatelli here again to give you the second online lecture for the heart. In this lecture, we will talk about blood flow to the heart, through the heart, and then away from the heart. Your reading is in Chapter 18, Sections 2 and 3, and your study guide question or course competency is number 7. From the previous discussion or lecture that you listened to for heart anatomy, you're probably already familiar with the function of the 4 heart chambers. But just to clarify, both atria fill simultaneously, then both of the atria contract, blood will move into both ventricles, then the ventricles are filled and they contract simultaneously, ejecting blood from the heart. The contraction cycle of the heart chambers ensures that blood is sent to the lungs and to body tissues at the same time. So the 2 atria contract, the right atrium, the left atrium contracts, blood is ejected or pushed into the 2 ventricles, right ventricle and left ventricle. Now, when these 2 ventricles contract, they send blood to two different parts of the body. The right ventricle will send blood to the lungs. The left ventricle will send blood out the aorta to body tissues. We call that the systemic circulation. So the heart is really a double pump, feeding 2 separate circuits of blood vessels. One circuit we call the pulmonary circuit, the other we call the systemic circuit. The right ventricle, shown here in blue and here in blue, is going to send blood to the lungs. That's the pulmonary circuit. The systemic circuit is when the left ventricle ejects blood and out the aorta to the rest of the body. That's systemic circuit. Now, blood will have to return to the heart, of course, in both cases. So from the lungs, blood will return to the left atrium. From the body, the systemic circuit, blood will return to the right atrium. If you trace the pulmonary circuit, then you see that it starts on the right side of the heart, goes to the lungs, and returns on the left side of the heart. Whereas the systemic circuit starts on the left side of the heart, goes to the body, and returns to the right side of the heart. The other thing that's noticeable about these 2 circuits is, and the map in general of blood flow, is that the right side of the heart, both the right atrium and the right ventricle, pump relatively deoxygenated blood that has already dropped off oxygen. Whereas the left side of the heart pumps blood that's rich in oxygen. And that's because blood that is pumped by the right ventricle has received that blood from the right atrium, which received the blood from the systemic circuit where oxygen has already been dropped off to the interstitial cells or tissues. So this deoxygenated blood goes to the lungs in the pulmonary circuit to become oxygenated. All of this is deoxygenated blood in blue. Then the left side of the heart pumps oxygenated blood. From the pulmonary circuit, oxygenated blood returns to the left atrium, which pumps the blood into the left ventricle, which pumps blood out the aorta to the rest of the body in the systemic circuit. So this oxygenated blood from the lungs is what gets sent throughout the systemic circuit. The names of the vessels of the pulmonary circuit are not intuitive when you look at a diagram, because we are used to thinking of red, first of all, as oxygen rich and blue as oxygen poor. That's true, but when we see red, we automatically think artery, and when we see blue, we automatically think vein. It's the opposite in the vessels of the pulmonary circuit. The right ventricle pumps blood out the pulmonary artery. That is deoxygenated blood. It's called an artery because the blood is leaving the heart. The pulmonary veins return the blood that has been oxygenated to the heart to get pumped to the systemic circulation. So these red vessels, they're veins, they're carrying blood back to the heart that has been oxygenated. So in the case of the pulmonary circuit, the pulmonary artery carries oxygen-poor blood, whereas the pulmonary vein carries oxygen-rich blood. In the systemic circuit, however, it's kind of back to normal. The aorta carries oxygen-rich blood, as do all these other red arteries. And these are veins carrying oxygen-poor blood from the systemic circulation. This one is meant to represent the inferior vena cava, and this one is meant to represent the superior vena cava. Both empty into the right atrium. So if I were a red blood cell and I needed to get oxygen and then deliver oxygen, I would go through the heart 2 times. So let's follow the pathway of a single red blood cell through the heart. I'm going to start with returning, a red blood cell returning from the body. Let's say it's returning from somewhere in the head. So it will come in through the superior vena cava. It enters the right atrium. The right atrium pumps it into the right ventricle. The right ventricle pumps the red blood cell out the pulmonary artery to the lung. Now it becomes oxygenated. So the red blood cell's happy, oxygen is binding to the hemoglobin, and it needs to come back to the heart to get pumped through the systemic circulation. So from the lung, the red blood cell will travel in a pulmonary vein. Then it will enter the left atrium. The atrium will contract. The red blood cell will be sent to the left ventricle. The left ventricle will contract, and the red blood cell will be sent out the aorta to somewhere in the body, which is number 10, the systemic circulation. Oops. Sorry about that. Factors that aid in the movement of blood and the direction of blood flow are 2 things. One, just contraction of muscle, myocardial contraction, and the other has to do with the sequence in which the chambers contract, as well as the presence of heart valves. So what provides the force for blood movement is actually the myocardial contraction. Blood pressure builds in the chambers, especially as the chamber wall contracts and it pushes on the blood. So that's a force that moves blood. And you can see that in the picture here. Going with the blood in the right ventricle going out the pulmonary artery. Now the sequence in which this chamber has filled compared to when the atrium fills, that has a lot to do with the direction that blood is going to flow. For example, the atria contract first, so blood goes down to the ventricles. Now, what prevents blood from going backwards? When the ventricle contracts or squeezes, You would think the blood would just squirt out any available opening. Well, it's the presence of these valves that prevent backflow. They open passively. The valves open passively when blood flows in the proper direction. Just the pressure would build in the atrium and go into the ventricle, or the pressure builds here in the ventricle and passes through the valves at the base of the pulmonary artery. But when this ventricle contracts, it presses the valves backwards, and they can't open that direction, largely because of the presence of the chordae tendineae, which don't allow their flaps to regurgitate into the previous chamber. So let's name those valves that are present inside the heart between the chambers and the vessels. There are two atrioventricular valves. That means valves that are between the atrium and the ventricle. So that word was atrioventricular valve. The one on the right has a special name. You could call it the right atrioventricular valve, but it has another name. We call it the tricuspid valve. The one on the left, shown here, this is the left atrioventricular valve, but of course it has a special name. It's called the bicuspid valve. And of course these two names reflect the number of flaps that are present. So there's 3 flaps or 3 cusps in the tricuspid valve, and there's 2 in the bicuspid valve. You may have also heard the bicuspid valve called the mitral valve. So this is the left atrioventricular valve, also known as the bicuspid valve. They prevent backflow into the atrium when the ventricles contract. The semilunar valves are the other 2 valves that we need to look at. They're called semilunar valves because their shape reflects a half moon. The one at the base of the pulmonary artery is called the pulmonary semilunar valve. The one that's at the base of the aorta that you can just see a little bit of right here is called the aortic semilunar valve. Both of those prevent blood from backflowing into ventricles. So once the ventricle has contracted and sent blood out these 2 major arteries, it relaxes, and blood could be sucked back into the ventricles. But due to the presence of these valves, it won't be. So valves open and close just due to blood pressure. The tricuspid is open here, the bicuspid is open here. But when backflow is attempted, the chordae tendineae will prevent a valve from prolapsing or regurgitating into the wrong chamber or into the atrium. Here's a picture of a prolapse occurring or regurgitation. So this looks like the bicuspid valve on the left side of the heart. This is the left ventricle. It's contracting. And an improper function would be that the blood could trickle into the upper left atrium if this valve is not properly anchored, if it's malfunctioning. So this is called a valve prolapse, or sometimes blood regurgitation. Okay, here's a review question for you. I'd like you to trace the path of a single red blood cell through the heart, and I will help you along and have you write these down a little bit. Let's start with number 1. Blood is returning in the superior and inferior vena cava into a chamber. What's the name of this chamber? Now blood crosses this valve. What's the name of this valve? Blood enters this chamber. What's the name of this chamber? It contracts. It sends blood out this vessel. Oh, forgot the valve. Crosses this valve, number 5. What's the name of this valve? I'll give you a little hint. Something semilunar valve. It's one of the semilunars. And then number 6, blood will go out this vessel, which is called the what? Now blood has gone to the red blood cells, gone to a lung. And it's going to return. And it returns in these vessels, one of these vessels, it won't be in both, obviously. Which vessel does it return in? What's the name of that? For number 8. It enters this chamber. What's the name of this chamber? It crosses this valve. What's the name of that valve? It enters this chamber then, number 11. What's the name of that chamber? Then it crosses this little tiny valve. You can, well, I mean, it's not that small, but because of the picture, it looks small. It crosses this valve to something semilunar valve, or number 12. And then the red blood cell will go out the vessel here, which is called the what? And then it goes to the systemic tissues. So answers are provided on this slide. This is posted on Blackboard. I'll take a couple seconds here for you to look and see how you did. Thank you. That's all for this lecture.